Hello. In this video, we're going to look at one of the most famous and most controversial studies in psychology, and that's Stanley Milgram's research on obedience, carried out in 1962 at Yale University. Milgram wanted to understand why so many ordinary people obeyed destructive orders during the Second World War, orders that led to mass killings of Jews, travelers, and gay people under the Nazi regime. And he wondered, were Germans somehow different? Were they naturally more obedient? Or could anyone under the right circumstances obey authority to an extreme, even cruel and immoral extent? To find out, he designed a controlled laboratory experiment to measure how far people would go when following an instruction that involved harming another person. Milgram created a mini documentary on this study, and I've included excerpts from it where it's relevant. To begin with, Milgram recruited 40 men aged between 20 and 50 from a range of jobs and education levels. Factory workers, salesmen, professionals, the whole range. And each one was told the study was about memory and learning. They were paid $4.50 simply for turning up, no matter what happened next. Each participant was greeted by the experimenter, wearing a gray lab coat to signal authority. And there was also another supposed volunteer present in the room. Actually, he was a Confederate working secretly with Milgram.
I should like to tell both of you a little about the memory project. Psychologists have developed several theories to explain how people learn. One theory is that people learn things correctly whenever they get punished for making a mistake. We want to find out just what effect different people have on each other as teachers and learners, and also what effect punishment will have on learning in this situation. Therefore, I'm going to ask one of you to be the teacher this afternoon, and the other to be the learner.
They drew slips to decide who would be the teacher and who would be the learner, but the draw was rigged, so the real participant was always the teacher. The learner was strapped into a chair in another room with electrodes attached to his arm, and the teacher sat in front of an impressive-looking shock generator with switches running from 15 to 450 volts, labeled with warnings like slight shock, danger, severe shock, and finally XXX.
This machine generates electric shocks. When you press one of the switches all the way down, the learner gets a shock.
All subjects are given identical instructions and a sample shock.
I'm going to ask you to close your eyes and estimate the number of holes you receive in the sample shock.
The teacher's task was to read pairs of words aloud, and every time the learner made a mistake, the teacher was told to deliver an electric shock, increasing the voltage by 15 each time. Now, in reality, there were no real shocks, but the setup was so convincing, with recorded protests and sound effects, that almost everyone believed it was genuine. At 150 volts, the learner began to protest.
Aye.
At 300 volts, he banged on the wall and then stopped responding altogether.
300 volts.
I absolutely refuse to answer anymore. Get me out of here. You can't harm me here. Get me out.
Beyond that point, he went completely silent.
I can't go on. He won't answer.
If a learner doesn't answer in a reasonable time, about 4 or 5 seconds, consider the answer wrong and follow the same procedures you have been doing for wrong answers. Say wrong, tell them the number of volts, give them the punishment, read them the correct answer. Continue, please.
Something's happened to that man then.
When the teacher hesitated or questioned what was happening, the experimenter used a set of standardized prompts, and these were, please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It's absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. Many participants showed visible stress when having to give these shocks, sweating, trembling, stuttering, even biting their lips, but they still continued. Milgram recorded that 65% of participants went all the way to 450 volts. That's the maximum level marked danger, severe shock, and only 12.5% of participants stopped at 300 volts. That's where the learner refused to respond. And yes, pardon the pun, but even Milgram was shocked by what he found. Before running the study, he'd asked psychologists and students and other colleagues to predict the results, and together they estimated that no more than 3% of people would go the full 450 volts. And as we've seen, the reality was 65%, far beyond what anyone expected. So what does this mean? Well, Milgram concluded that ordinary people can be remarkably obedient to authority even when asked to do something that goes against their conscience. It wasn't that his participants were evil or sadistic. Most were clearly distressed. Instead, the social situation put them under intense pressure to obey. Milgram believed that several situational factors helped explain this. The presence of an authority figure in a lab coat, the prestige of Yale University. I mean, it was and is one of the top universities in the world, so would they do something that was so wrong? And then the way the responsibility seemed to lie with the experimenter rather than the participant. After all, he said he'd take responsibility for the learner's well-being. These ideas became the foundation for Milgram's later studies, where he tested what happened when those factors changed. After the experiment, every participant was fully debriefed. They were told the shocks weren't real, and they were introduced to the learner again, who was completely fine. Most participants said they were glad to have taken part, although many were clearly very relieved. So why is Milgram's research important? Well, it became a cornerstone of social psychology, and we still study it 60 years later. It showed that the power of authority can push ordinary people to do extraordinary, even harmful things. And it continues to raise deep questions about responsibility, morality, and the influence of the situation. I'd like to finish this video with Stanley Milgram's own words.
Many people, not knowing much about the experiment, claim that subjects who go to the end of the board are sadistic. Nothing could be more foolish as an overall characterization of these persons. The context of their action must always be considered. The individual, upon entering the laboratory, becomes integrated into a situation that carries its own momentum. The results, as I observe them in the laboratory, are disturbing. They raise the possibility that human nature cannot be counted on to insulate men from brutality and inhumane treatment at the direction of malevolent authority. A substantial proportion of people do what they are told to do, irrespective of the content of the act and without limitations of conscience, so long as they perceive that the command comes from a legitimate authority. If in this study an anonymous experimenter could successfully command adults to subdue a 50-year-old man and force on him painful electric shocks against his protests, one can only wonder what government, with its vastly greater authority and prestige, can command of its subjects.